Hello, my name's Mark Kelly and welcome to another episode of Crossed Wires, the show where we try to bring clarity through conversation. In our last episode, we played the first part of my interview with Andy Robertson, an expert in gaming and culture, and we explored how gaming no longer reflects the stereotype of nerdy teenage boys glued to their screens for hours in a darkened room. In fact, we learned that the gaming industry is worth more financially than the whole of the movie and music industries combined. Gaming isn't going anywhere, with ever more inventive ways to hook us in, such as augmented and virtual reality. Andy challenged us to think of games not solely as something we play, removed from the process of creation, but to think of them as something we interact with and in doing so, become part of the narrative. In part 2 of my interview with Andy, we go a little deeper into different types of games that are not what we might think of when we think gaming. But before we get into the final part of my conversation with Andy, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all those of you who've watched our first episode, especially those of you who got in touch to give us your feedback. Your comments and engagement will help us make this show better and more accessible. Ultimately, a YouTube channel is nothing without an audience, and we hope that by bringing you these interviews, we can all learn something new and fascinating, and that this channel adds something to the conversation of faith and culture. So let me say at this point, if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so and share the link wherever you can. If you'd like to get in touch with anything to do with the show, please do email us at hello@crosswires.uk. And at the end of today's episode, I'll wrap up with a few more thoughts about what's been said, as well as giving you a sneak peek of what's coming up in the next episode of Crossed Wires. Without further ado then, here's the second part of Andy Robertson's interview. Let's see what he has to say about gaming, morality and faith. Now, talking of unpopular suggestions, just coming back to that programme that you did with Kate Bortley, there were a few comments. I know that a number of them seemed to change their mind towards the end of it about video games, but there were a few going, this doesn't belong in church. This isn't, I'm never going to touch video games, just as what you were saying just then. So have we missed it? Has the church in general, Big C, has it missed a trick in developing online stuff ourselves? You know, as Christians, have we missed a trick in developing materials that could cater to the more, you know, spiritual side of people, and how could we as churches use gaming more powerfully to get into those, you know, what I mentioned, those deeper, meaningful conversations, particularly I think just a little bit older with like the young adults, late teenagers, early 20s.
Yeah, I think the danger is at the moment churches are quite effective at pivoting to being online, and we're quite pleased about that. I think we quite like how we're still here, we've got Zoom down now, you know, we figured it out, we haven't, it's not all collapsed.
And
the danger
we seem to be, you're right, we seem to be quite happy about that, don't we? Look at what we've done, look how
exactly, we're still here, and actually maybe it's a bit better, and you know, God's got a plan for this, that kind of thing. The danger is that we kind of miss out on the kind of detailed, careful listening to what's around us and act as if we're experts in this space when kind of we're not, because no one is in a way. And so that's the trick we can miss out on, is not paying attention to the detail of some of these experiences, and maybe discarding them in a way because they're new. And I mean, it's a kind of a tangent slightly, but an interesting parallel is sometimes people stop me in those kind of church spaces and say, it's not appropriate. Like, this is all fun and good, and it's nice for the TV, but you know, how can you say these games are meaningful? Because look, half of them are just shooting people, and I wish that we could just get rid of them because kids would just be better without them. And in a faith setting, a Christian setting, it's a fascinating conversation because obviously we have our text, the Bible, which is just as violent as any of these video games, and you know, in hugely problematic ways. But of course, we're really good at not letting that violence eclipse the value of those stories. And we know how to not necessarily just diminish it or deny it, but to say, look, this is part of what is in our history. It's not going away. But we're going to work out how to deal with it as adults and as honest as we can be. And maybe sometimes you might say we don't know how to deal with it, but that kind of that experience and that knowledge is really helpful, I think, to how we might look at games, and to not let a violent game mean that it's not a meaningful game, and not to let the games as a whole be dismissed because they're kind of seen as being violent.
What kind of meaning would you derive from a violent game? So I guess ones that I'm aware of, Call of Duty, things like that.
Well, I mean, you could. It's like you could say this, about chopping up prostitutes and sending them around the country in the Bible. You could pick some interesting texts, couldn't you? Or regime change or genocide, if you want to use that language. And so you have some interpretation work to do. But I think one of the benefits of the video game is that you can't distance yourself from it. So we can say, oh, that was just the Old Testament. We have Jesus now. And of course that's not. And we kind of like dismiss that as if it's not part of the Bible. Whereas when you're doing that violence in a video game, you're a perpetrator. And it's like, oh yeah, this is part of my story. And this is part of what I'm doing. And so you have to face that and understand what your emotions are like. Consider what other people, what is the wider story? Is it appropriate? What do I think about violence? And so it's not like a nicely wrapped, if you play this, you can take a little sermon in it and you can take it away. But it means that you have to kind of face that violence and appreciate how horrid it is. And particularly the more graphic end of the games made for adults, how abhorrent it is, and, how manipulative, and the sort of the power fantasies that are being played out. In often quite historical, setups. And so I think that would be one of the things that I would suggest is useful. And of course, there are many games that use that violence and then use it intentionally. There's a game called This War of Mine, where it's a war game, but you don't play the army character, you play a civilian trying to survive in Sarajevo, in the siege of Sarajevo. And you're trying to get enough resources to keep your family safe and to keep your kids safe. And people come to the door and you have to decide, well, do I help them? Do I let them in? Are they a threat? And you go out at night and try and scavenge materials. And so that's quite a violent game. It's an 18-rated game, I think. But it's one that then again uses the violence to give an experience that pushes you in a direction. So I think just understanding that there's this breadth of experience. And then even in the ones which are very straightforward, like the most difficult texts in the Bible, there's still some really helpful interpretation work you can do. And that's why you need adults there to ask those questions. So if your child's playing Call of Duty, whether or not they're the right age, to be able to ask them, oh, how do you feel about this? Or, do you understand the wider context? Like my son was playing Fortnite and he was very much like, oh yeah, got him in the head, brilliant. Yeah, he's dead, what's the next one? And like using quite aggressive language. And so I took the step that not everyone seems to appreciate when I've shared it online, saying, I don't mind you playing this, but I want you to understand the realities of war. And so he was 12 at the time, and I got him to agree to watching Saving Private Ryan with me, so he could get kind of the other side of that it's not just cartoons for fun, but it is a really horrid experience. And that wasn't to stop him playing it. It was just to give him a bit of balance. And so he could then watch that with me. It took some convincing. And I was like, we can stop if you want. And if it's too much, we'll turn it off. But he was like, oh yeah, it's really horrid, isn't it, Dad? And like, oh, I didn't realize, there was real kind of interesting conversation. So I think by me being present in that experience, I could then help him interpret it. And that's kind of an extreme scenario. But in all sorts of ways, if we're part of that, then that's possible. And I think it's hard to do that if you haven't played games yourself. And I'm not suggesting parents go and play Fortnite, but the sorts of games would be, games about refugees, or maybe that.
Just to pause you there, you kind of sent me some homework, as it were, to investigate a game.
Of course, I forgot. I did, didn't I?
You did. The title, unfortunately, on my phone is shorthand, so I don't know. Bury me.
That's right, My Love.
That's it. And
yep.
You mentioned that you downloaded that game with all your family can downloaded it, and that you follow this girl who is trying to make her way out of a horrible situation, a refugee, and you said that you talk about that. It's in real time, isn't it? The actions that not that you decide to take on her behalf, but the way you encourage her, the way that you say things to her, the way that you react to things that she's going to do. It's like in a text message format, isn't it? Going back and forth, and it's kind of real time over a number of days. And you said that it gives you an opportunity to chat to your family about it, about the things that she's doing because of the options they've made. Tell us about that, because that's that kind of refugee situation. So it's alluding to the horrors of war and horrible situations, but it's not directly. It's not in your face.
Yeah, it is. But it sounds like you didn't play it.
I certainly have.
Oh, you have?
Oh yes, it's here on my phone. It's right here.
I mean, it'd be great to start just by hearing what you made of it. How far did you get, and what decisions did you make?
Well, I've got to the point where she is not getting on the boat. Or rather, she was dumped at the shore side with an Iraqi family, and I hope I'm not giving anything away for people who might want to.
Yeah, I guess it's worth saying. You know, if we're talking about some of the games, then inevitably there's a few spoilers. But I think in this context, the spoilers are worth it because it means that then you can actually uncover what the value is.
Well, what's intrigued me about it? I mean, obviously I could critique the game, but what's more important to me is how my 3 kids have picked it up and got into it. There's no shooting. There's no you're not shooting people in the head and things like that, and you're not doing all those other what you think young people might think are exciting. They're into. Oh, I've got a text from the girl, and they open up their phones and they say, "Oh, well, I've got a text," and she said, "No, don't tell me. Don't tell me what she's doing."
It's different. Yeah, so maybe just lay out rough of what the game is. So you play the husband of a Syrian woman called Nur, and her family.
Well, we just defaulted to calling her the girl, so that's not right, is it? No,
yeah, okay. A woman called Nur, and she her family gets killed in an explosion, and together you decide the best course of action for her is to travel to Europe. So you, as her husband, stay in Syria because you need to for work and other reasons. But she takes her phone, obviously, and much like real migrants and refugees do, they have a conversation, and it's similar to the sort of conversation you'd have on WhatsApp or on a text message. And it's like what you'd have with a spouse. So she will go somewhere, and she'll arrive maybe at the bus station, and she'll just say, as I'm sure you've heard now, "Oh, I'm here, but it's going dark and there's no one here. I'm not sure what to do." And so in your responses, you'll just maybe say, "How do you feel?" Or maybe you encourage her to stay, or just do a smiley face, and that will affect her choices. So like you're saying in your family, when you're playing it together, that's why your kids don't want to hear necessarily, what your bit is, because they will be taking a different route. And what soon starts happening with your interactions is there's about 1,000 different routes this character can take and about 20 different endings. And as you do that, it sort of plots it on a graph, on a map, so you can see where you're going. But the key, one of the nice things is it's in real time. So if she's traveling, or if her phone's out of charge, or if she's on a boat or a plane or whatever, then you don't hear from her, and then suddenly she'll pop up on your phone like a text message and like, "I've made it, I've got to the border, but I think they're going to let us through, but they're not sure, and I'm not sure, and these armed guards are here."
Yeah, she snuck onto a bus on mine, but there we are.
Yeah, exactly. and it's just a lovely kind of really well written kind of novel. It's about 70,000 words. It's like reading a novel, but
it definitely is. Yes,
it connects you emotionally with that person and that situation. And my experience, as I was saying before we started recording, is that I suddenly had a different relationship with that topic. I thought I was well informed, and I was, about the information, but after playing the game, the next time I saw a boat on the sea, kept trying to make it over.
You thought about that character.
Yeah, I was like, "Oh my gosh, there's a person on there," and I knew that already, but I hadn't experienced it already, and so it suddenly became a very different sort of scenario. And so for me, that was a really beautiful way that I had my eyes opened really to the realities of that situation in a way that nothing else had managed to do. And I think I see a lot of God's fingerprints on that experience, both in how it's delivered and how it invites you, and also how it's very fragile. Like it's something you have to step into and accept. It's easy to break and be like, "Oh, it's just a game," and just be silly about it. But all games have this kind of fragility to them, that if you honor that, you can really hear something quite surprising.
I kind of like the way that, because when we think of situations like that, we think doom and gloom and negativity, and of course there's a lot to be sad about, and to not want to hear or see. But within the game, it was the use of the emojis. I know it sounds really silly, but the use of emojis brought a humanity to it. It brought a reality, but a humanity that, yes, these people are suffering, that they're having to make horrible choices, but they're our brothers and sisters. They're and they love and they care and they laugh and they cry, and it brings a humanity to to those people. I guess, like you say, next time you see these things on the news or you read about them, you can begin to connect emotion to it and not just it's information that's being fed to me.
Yeah, and I like that whole the emoji thing, because it is often like be asked a question and there's not a right answer. There's nothing you can do. And so you want to do something, and so you can just send a hug or a smiley face or something like that, or a tearful face, in kind of admitting, yeah, I don't know what to do. I'm helpless. And so rather than a power fantasy, it's like a disempowerment fantasy. So you step into being powerless. And again, obviously, that chimes deeply with anyone who follows Jesus, I think.
I want to come back to that question about has the church missed a trick? Do you think we need to be on this and in that kind of environment, creating games like that have that maybe a little bit more obvious gospel centric message through it? Do we need to work on that as a church? Big C, or do you know of any developers who have faith and they're working that into their games as well?
There are lots of examples. I mean, I think it's a bit of an ideological question, because for me, I don't know how much more like Jesus you could get than trying to hold this vulnerable refugee as she's going from one place to another and walking with her, carrying her disappointments and hopes and danger. So, for me, that's as Jesus as it gets. and that leads me on to sort of say the danger is that we as a church decide, oh, this is great, but we need to do our version, and we do a more Jesus-y version. And it's like you see an amazing painting that communicates how beautiful creation is, or something about a person, and you're like, oh, that painting's amazing. Right, we need to set up a fund so that Christians can do paintings like this, and as if we have to have a Christian stamped version, whereas actually a better thing to do would be to get people to that painting and to get them to encounter what God's already doing in this beautiful piece of art. And so that's my perspective, is we spend our time and resources much better at becoming really eloquent and literate in what games are available, and then getting people to them, and so that they can have these experiences. There are lots of examples of, like, the Scripture Union's got a game for kids that's very kind of scripture based, and it's really a way of telling those scripture stories. And I guess it's not wrong or bad, but I know that they've spent millions of pounds on it, that in my perspective, it would be much better to have spent that money to get people to the amazing paintings rather than trying to do our own one, because I think that will always be kind of limited because it's been ideologically driven rather than something that's kind of sprung up.
Yeah, so using the medium to create the conversation.
That's already there. And that's the thing, because there's so much of this. Like that example of the Bury Me My Love game isn't like one shiny example in a rare thing. That's what, and they've got this database that's linked to the book on it's taminggaming.com, and there's loads of lists of games there of very similar experiences. It takes in all sorts of different directions, and there's basically thousands of these sorts of games. And they're not all going to be ones we want to promote and love, like paintings or books or films, but loads of them are. And also there are then also some interesting examples of games that have been made about difficult subjects that happen to have been made by Christians as well, and that do include parables and talk of Jesus and gospels and stuff like that, but kind of as a part of the life that they came from, almost an unavoidable consequence rather than something that's been inserted. There's a game that's worth mentioning called That Dragon Cancer, which is kind of heartbreaking. It's about a family that's got a small boy with brain cancer, and it's their story about what that's like, and it's their kind of invitation to say, would you like to join us in this sort of 2-hour experience? And again, it completely rewrites what you think about those kind of settings, and grapples with praying for healing, hoping for healing, and is it coming, is it not coming, and where's our hope? And there's loads of iconography that runs through the game, the lifeboat and the lighthouse, and so it's kind of stitched into that whole experience. And what's interesting is that game has been hugely well received by the game community, whereas a game that was created with an ideological purpose, or with the idea of spreading Jesus, would be rooted out very quickly, because they're amazing at seeing through. Kids are like, they know when you're not just giving it to them straight, and they're like, there's something behind this sort of thing. But that game, That Dragon Cancer, everyone completely accepted it and loved it in its whole, because it was this coherent whole that wasn't driven by some sort of desire to say something particular. It was just like, we need to share the story of our son
because this is how we're processing it. If you'd like to join us, then here's a way to do it.
Hugely, I heard about that game. I haven't played it, unfortunately, but I heard about it on the news a few years ago. And there's and a few write-ups about it. And it, as with the games we've talked about today, there's an authenticity about them, isn't there? You're not detaching them from reality, but you're helping people engage with things that they might not normally come across.
Yeah.
So there's an authenticity to it.
So you can see that game obviously struck a chord with you. You remember the story. I don't know whether you knew it was a Christian game or not from a Christian creator.
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah.
And that's interesting in and of itself.
But
that wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It was just, this is a game with meaning.
Exactly. But it's kind of not surprising in when you're retelling that you haven't played it. Because that's not what we do. Whereas maybe if we were talking about a book or a film, and you're like, oh, yeah, I saw this film, it looked amazing, it had this reference about, whatever, and I'd be like, oh, what was it like? And you're like, yeah, I didn't watch it. I mean, why didn't you watch it? And actually, for that game, That Dragon Cancer, you can play on a smartphone, on a PC, and it just takes 2 hours. You can't get stuck, and if you do get stuck, you can move to the next chapter, and it's really simple and engaging, and it's got beautiful music. And so once you get that information alongside the game into someone's hands, they're like, oh, well, perhaps I'll play it. And so that's kind of the exciting bit, I think. And that's the kind of piece of work that I think the church could be really, instrumental in sort of giving games this platform in a way. And that's kind of what we're doing in the services. People think it's about, making the services cool, but it's not. It's actually accessing those older people and getting to see what it's like when they first hold a PlayStation controller, because it's this kind of magical moment where they're stepping into this new way of understanding the world.
Yeah, it's helping people break out of their paradigms and understand that they are capable and can use this other kind of media. I think what you said there, that we wouldn't talk about a film if we haven't watched it generally, and we wouldn't talk about a book if we haven't read it, not in any great detail, yet we seem to be quite happy to do that with video games. But we need to raise the level of awareness to a wider generation, that these things, it's a legitimate art form with legitimate stories to tell that can help us think, and again, within the context of this conversation, can help the church, actually can help us engage with people at a real authentic level.
Yeah.
I guess, let me ask you a cliched, it sounds like a cliche question, but maybe I've got to throw it at you. So if Jesus had been born in our century, would he be using games with his friends? Would he be teaching people to have faith in God and to love God using games in such a scenario?
Yeah, we had a set of questions before we started, and I was like, oh, that's one I should probably think about ahead of time, but I haven't. But I think particularly the games that highlight sort of vulnerable and marginalised individuals, I think he'd be drawn to. I think he'd be good at subverting the kind of powerful power fantasy games that are maybe very popular. So I think it'd be interesting to see what he might say about Fortnite or loot boxes or some of those kind of things.
Yeah.
Because I love the way Jesus takes that text of the day and then subverts it and changes it and says things about the Old Testament that were there, but to my eye, he's kind of stretching things in a way that people weren't expecting and kind of doing things to that text that hadn't really been done in that way before. And so I often will see video games as texts. And I think he would do that. He would be playing some games, but he'd be uncovering some things in those games that we play that maybe we don't notice and just shining a light on them. And I think part of that would be to say, actually, you're missing some of the games that are really good because they're not commercial and because they're not advertised on bus stops. So I think that's why I'm quite motivated with some of this work, because I think he'd be quite into sharing. Don't play Call of Duty, play Bury Me My Love. Don't play Fortnite, play another game. And I don't think it would necessarily be all the games that are kind of the worthy or right on or have these deep, but there also be ones with community and the little games that sort of spring up and get adopted by all the kids. They love it. They swarm to these new games.
There is one, I think, very much like that. And it was on your website, actually, as the number one game, I think, this week. And my kids have got us into it over the last few weeks as well. And it's called Among Us, isn't it? I believe. And it is a game that's been around for a while, but has just exploded because the ease of community, or the ease of kind of logging in and working together and working things out together has certainly spoken to my kids, and it sounds to me like not just children, but all sorts of generations are getting into this one particular game as an example that things can explode.
Have you played that or watched them play it? Do you get that?
Oh no, I've played it. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And so, because it's really nice, isn't it? Because you have what's kind of a pretty straightforward setup for a video game. A group of people are on a spaceship. One or two of those people are trying to murder the others, and obviously it's quite a violent game. It's rated 16, which obviously is interesting because a lot of the people playing it will be under 16. But the interesting thing is, if you walk into a room and there's somebody there who looks like they just murdered someone, you basically press a button and stop the game, and everyone just stops playing and starts talking, and then it's a conversation of who do you think did it, and you're like, well, I walked into the computer room and that guy was by a vent, the red guy, and there was a dead body, it's got to be him. And of course the red guy's like, he would say that, he's the one that killed him, and you have this kind of Cluedo whodunit.
And it's not graphic, it's not overly graphic, is it? It's not kind of...
Well, it depends how you consider it. It's cartoon graphics.
Yeah.
But the things that are depicted by the cartoon graphics, because the bodies remain in the area, so you have corpses that have been murdered, and you have a bit of blood, and that's why it's a 16. So in Fortnite, when you kill somebody, the body disappears, and so it has that unreal sort of feel to it. Whereas in this game, although it's more cartoony than Fortnite, because the body remains in the game and remains on the floor, that's what triggers this 16 rating. If you carry on that little thread, if you could then go ahead and mutilate those bodies, chop limbs off or decapitate them, that's what would then make it an 18. So that's how it sits between 18 and 12 and 16, which are the three.
Just before we finish, it'd be great just to hear a little bit more about your YouTube channel, Taming Gaming, and maybe a little bit more about how your book kind of ties into that's been released in January 2021, I think was the date I've seen online.
Yeah, so the book is like a 3-year project. I was asked to write it by this publisher called Unbound, and they offset the risk of publishing unusual books like this by getting the author, myself, to get pre-orders, which I did. Hundreds of families have pre-ordered it, but also companies like Xbox, Roblox, the people who do the PEGI ratings, the people in the States who do the ESRB ratings. So it's this kind of funny coalition, which kind of represents a lot of my work, really, where it stands in the middle, understanding what games are, but understanding the realities of families. And it's had support from both those sides, YMCA and Internet Matters and some charities. And it offers, like I was saying earlier on, it grasps that nettle about violence, about addiction, about spending and gambling, and about online strangers, and talks in detail about them. I've done a lot of research. I've talked to psychologists, and I've done a whole load of reading. But then the through line is, like we've been saying today, what you need to do is to play games yourself as a parent. And of course, in the book it says, I know that sounds bonkers. And I know that you wouldn't know, why would you want to play Fortnite? And I'm saying, yes, don't play Fortnite, not on your own. And at the back of the book, though, is what's essentially a recipe book. It's a full colour hardback book. And then you have these double page spreads, one to a game, that tell you what the game is with some really beautiful pictures and graphics, what you need to play them, and what the experience will be like. So you, as a parent, you can flick through those games and sort of find something like you would over mealtime, really, to spend the time finding a really nice family game that you might play on your own, or that you might all play together. So that's kind of the book, and that was supposed to be out in October, but because of the virus, the printing's delayed, so that'll be January. But kind of almost what's becoming more exciting is the database that supports the book at taminggaming.com. I started by thinking, I've got this book, but it needs to be searchable. So I'll take those 60 recipes, those games, and put them into a little database. So I did that just at the time that the virus was kicking off and people wanted more information. And so I had a little bit of funding to accelerate that. So we created this database and started adding games. And in the kind of about 4 months, it's now got about 750 games that you can search. And so you can search them by like a Netflix list. So if you want to find games that are solving a mystery or surviving the night or making a new world or competing on the couch, or even also finding some calm or finding some hope. They've got some lists about games that create space where you can process grief. And there's some really unusual areas. And obviously we include games like Bury Me, My Love. And then in those lists, you can then filter them by, say, age rating or by the console that you've got. So you can then have a very bespoke list of, here's some really good games for you.
And then most recently, I'm really excited that that's been extended to include loads of data about accessibility. So if you're a person who has who is blind or is deaf or hard of hearing, or maybe has a motor impairment, or maybe has a cognitive issue where you don't want to have games that are high pressure or that are time limited, as well as details about how hard it is to read and subtitles, you can now go and search for games that will suit that, particularly if you're an advocate or a carer for a child who's got a special need or additional need. You can then find games for them. And these are just the same pool of games, but just pulling out the data that you need to know. So, for example, one challenge can be if you have a motor impairment, holding down a trigger on a game can be really difficult, or pressing a button really quickly. So those two things often rule you out from playing a game. And so you can get a game and then you start to play it and realize, oh, I can't play this because I physically can't hold a button down for long enough. And so in the database, you can just say holds is optional and rapid pressing not required. And then the list of games in the database is filtered to just return the ones that you want.
Right.
So, and I think that's important because we're saying that, games are this new media. And so it's important that as many people as possible have access to them. So that's kind of, that's the database. So I'm excited about that.
Wonderful. We're going to wrap up, Andy, but I just wonder whether you'd like to leave us with all that we talked about for this last hour, whether you'd like to leave us with any final thoughts.
Well, I think the main thing is, as I ended the conversation before this with you, is really, if you take away anything, try and find some games that you as an adult, if you're an adult listening, I'm presuming this is mostly adults, want to play yourself. And if you've got kids, find a game that you can have a meaningful interaction with. If you go to the database, there's a list called My First Video Game, which is designed for people who've never played games and includes things like Bury Me, My Love. And take that first step into games as something that might be for you, take a risk on them. And my experience is that they'll turn out to be something that you don't expect them to be. And that's the most powerful way to revolutionize kind of how you see games in terms of spirituality, but also in terms of parenting and caring for children, how you see, what games are like, what they might or might not be doing to them. And as soon as your kids hear that that's happening, they'll, like you were saying, they'll be like, what do you mean you're playing a game? That's what we do. Like, what are you playing? And suddenly it just happens without you almost doing anything, that this conversation is completely revolutionized. So that's the kind of, I think that would be the one thing I'd hope people would take home.
Thanks, Andy. And where might people contact you? Twitter, Facebook, things like that?
Yeah, so the website is taminggaming.com. So that's two words, a double G in the middle, taminggaming.com. And on Twitter, I'm Geek Dad Gamer.
I love that Twitter. That's great.
And some people are like, oh, you don't look very Greek. And I'm like, no, not Greek. Geek Dad. So that's Geek Dad
Spelling
Gaming.
error.
Yeah, those are the easiest places. On the website, there's like a contacts and stuff, and I have email stuff as well. But those are the easiest ones. And there's also a Facebook group that if people have got direct questions, and again, there's a link on the website to that.
Wonderful. Well, I'll try and put all those links on this together with this video, in the show notes and what have you, and people can go and peruse those and have a look and get to know you a bit more. Well, listen, Andy, thank you so much for your time.
Great.
Really, really appreciate it. Fascinating conversation. There were so many different tangents I could have gone on, but I'm trying to keep this as concise as possible. But just wonderful. Thank you for your time, and take care. God bless.
Okay, thanks a lot.
For those of you with any Christian faith watching this, I think Andy sets us something of a challenge. Quite rightly, one of the obstacles for those investigating faith and spirituality is the issue of violence in the Old Testament. How do we approach this and begin to explain its presence in the history of a faith that's supposedly built on a foundation of love? Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that Christianity isn't built on the foundational idea of a loving God, but I can understand why questioners point to the seemingly hypocritical nature of it. As Andy shared with us, the Bible has stories within it that tell a tale of violence, just like some video games. Yet we, as Christians, accept this as part of the greater narrative. We don't let the violence detract from the overriding goodness that comes from our faith. We don't diminish nor deny our biblical history, but importantly, we learn how to understand how it fits within the Christian framework. The question is often asked of video games. How can anything with such violence in its design have any use in a civilized society? What can we possibly learn from violent games? But have we ever considered the possibility that some violent games, such as this War of Mine that Andy mentioned, actually have a powerful social message behind them? Can we approach those difficult, violent passages in the same way and ask the same questions of them? Are we willing to sit down and discuss why some games are so popular? Is it because they simply present us with an opportunity to play with power, or is there something else at work? It seems to me that engaging with challenging content takes a level of maturity that recognises we may have something to learn from what we might initially find uncomfortable or offensive. Andy also suggested in our conversation that those of us in the church can sometimes be in danger of thinking that because we've mastered the technology, we've got it down and we don't need to do any more than the bare minimum. In 2020, the year of global lockdown, so many church communities rushed online to make their services available. But my experience was that many merely took what they did on a Sunday and acted it out in front of a camera, even staying behind a pulpit to preach and presenting their worship experience on the stage. But how many of us consider the digital world that we've now become a part? Did we look at the technology we're now using, the way the audiences themselves use it, and take some time to think how might be best to utilise this different environment? Andy made a challenging statement. It's a big temptation for churches to stop listening, to ignore how people experience and use digital media, including gaming, and act like we're experts on how to communicate with God and one another. Could gaming, something that millions of people enjoy doing worldwide, actually help us worship God? If you're watching this and you're not a churchgoer or someone with religious faith, how do you look at what's been presented to you as church online? Does it feel like you can have a voice? All this to ask, how is the church approaching gaming culture? Is the church enabling and equipping people to enter the gaming arena and create games that, well, they're not only engaging but also speak to issues of life at large? Is the church encouraging positive, creative gaming that speaks into situations where a compassionate voice needs to be heard and demonstrated? Is the church encouraging gaming that speaks of faith, spirituality, and ultimately the meaning of life? Is it time for the church to engage with what is already out there and help people of faith or none have a conversation together about the kinds of issues raised and addressed across a whole swathe of different games? We readily accept that movies and books teach us lessons, show us truths, evoke a reaction. Is it time for wider society and people across all generations to recognise that this billion-dollar industry, this hugely popular medium of storytelling, provides a legitimate platform to raise awareness of different issues and should form part of our wider social conversations? From the church pulpit, I hear examples of movies and books which help bring home a point being made. Is there a strong argument that games could also be used in the same useful way? Well, I believe so. Gaming is a legitimate art form with real stories to tell, told together in genuine communities. So this second part of Annie's interview, I think, brings real challenge to the established traditional church and how we engage with gaming and technology as a whole, but it also presents us with a real opportunity. Can we all come together, from all faiths and none, to use gaming, the biggest entertainment medium on the planet, as a forum to tackle, discuss many of the ideas and issues of our day? What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. Write to us at hello@crossedwires.uk. I hope that today's interview has given you a different perspective on gaming. But not only that, I hope that my conversation with Andy Robertson has given you stuff to think about when it comes to faith and spirituality and how these things interact in our modern world. And if you'd like to know more about the Christian faith, I encourage you to get in touch and let's begin a journey of discovery together. In the next episode of Crosswires, we have a fascinating interview with music producer Will Weeks. Will shares interesting insights on the music industry and how he works out his faith in that environment, and indeed what effect it has on how he deals with people and projects. And what gives this interview a twist is that Will is heavily involved in writing and producing chart-topping K-pop bands, That's a South Korean phenomenon that swept across the world. And if you're a young person in the UK, the chances are that you have a favourite K-pop band, or at the very least know one or two big names. I hope that's piqued your interest, and if you're over 30, maybe you can learn one or two things and help you get down with the kids. I've been your host, Mark Kelly, so please do join me for that next episode of Crossed Wires, the show where we try to bring clarity through conversation.